My name's Dan Zweig, chair of the Fort Wayne's P2G project, and we welcome you to our turn at P2G's Here We Are project. Today's session is hosted by the Jewish Federation of Fort Wayne as part of, as I said, the Here We Are project. Each month, P2G puts a spotlight on one of our partner communities. I will keep this part short so that we have plenty of time for the anthropology of beer, which is why you're all here today. The partnership is a platform for encouraging people-to-people relationships through cultural, social, educational, and community-based programs. Our partnership family is made up of 16 Jewish communities in the central US, the Israeli municipalities of Akko and Mate Asher in the Western Galilee, and Budapest, Hungary. P2G is a program of the Jewish Agency. There are 46 partnerships that engage and connect with more than 350,000 Jewish people worldwide. The partnership mission is to promote mutually beneficial activities between our membership communities. We accomplish this by creating relationships through shared responsibility and knowledge, embracing our diversity, harnessing innovation, and reinforcing our continuity through programs that build Jewish identity and strengthen our communities while forming global connections among and between the United States, Israel, and Budapest. Partnership together is a way to bridge the gap of understanding and bring us together in the spirit of our faith. It not only creates deep interpersonal relationships that transcend location, but it also celebrates our rich heritage, our differences, and the culture that unites us all. We harness the power of our collective. Thank yous today to partnership leadership, Leslie Kramer and Elisha Flax, our co-chairs, and all the volunteers across the country, Jackie Schreier, the executive director of the Fort Wayne Jewish Federation, and all of you who are making this possible. We're now going to start a little bit of background on the Jewish community in Fort Wayne and how we got here and why we got here. Go to the next one. Here's a little history about the Fort Wayne, Indiana area. I'll keep it short. We'll just start 12,000 years ago and go from there. As the glaciers from the last ice age receded, the rivers and lakes that resulted left Fort Wayne in a very advantageous spot. We sit on the shortest navigatable trade route between Quebec and the Atlantic Ocean and New Orleans on the Gulf of Mexico. Up the Maumee River from Lake Erie, a short half-day portage, jump back into your canoe and be on your way south to the Wabash River, connecting to the Ohio River and finally the Mississippi. Native Americans wisely set up camp here to control and tax the traffic, which by the early 1700s included fur trading explorers. Later came the British, and then under the direction of General Anthony Wayne, an American fort was established. Soon a canal route allowed for larger boats. Steam railroads replaced the canal and Fort Wayne grew. In 1820, John Jacob Hayes became the first Jewish settler in Fort Wayne, following his appointment as Indian agent by President James Monroe. Indian agents were individuals authorized to conduct business between Native American tribes and the US government. In the decades that followed, German Jewish immigrants arrived and thrived as peddlers, carrying and trading goods from settlement to settlement. As their businesses grew, they later became merchants. Their success led to 23 men to form a society to care for the sick and bury the dead, and by 1848 had raised $200 to purchase a burial ground as Fort Wayne's first Jewish cemetery. In October of that year, the group officially organized as Congregation Achdus V'Sholem and held services in the stately home of Hannah and Frederick Nerdlinger in downtown Fort Wayne. In 1874, the congregation embraced Reform Judaism, becoming a charter member of the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, now known as the Union for Reform Judaism. From those beginnings, the Jewish community continued to grow. Immigration from the 1880s to 1914 brought Jews from Russia, Poland, and Austria and Romania, many of them escaping pogroms. Those from Russia formed Congregation B'nai Israel in 1894, while newcomers from Poland and Lithuania created Congregation B'nai Jacob in 1912. These new immigrants wanted their own cemetery and founded the Orthodox Jewish Cemetery, now known as the Fort Wayne Jewish Cemetery, in 1912. Go back to this one. All right, okay. In 1921, 100 years ago, members of Fort Wayne's 3 congregations came together to work on behalf of the entire Jewish community, forming the Jewish Federation of Fort Wayne as a welfare and relief organization. B'nai Israel closed in 1937, with its members affiliating with Achdus V'Sholem or B'nai Jacob, which itself closed in 2019. By the early 20th century, Jewish merchants had a significant presence in downtown Fort Wayne as store operators and owners. 2 such stores, Frank's Dry Goods and Wolf and Dessauer's, dominated the retail scene. By mid-century, dozens of Jewish-owned smaller specialty stores could be found. After World War II, Americans all across the country moved to the suburbs. National retail shopping chains followed. Downtowns withered. Fort Wayne was no different. Only in the past decade or two has our downtown seen a revival, with newcomers choosing an urban lifestyle. Over the years, various Jewish organizations had formed chapters in Fort Wayne, including the Jewish War Veterans, Hadassah, B'nai B'rith, and Zionist groups. Today, the Achdus V'Sholem and the Jewish Federation are the mainstays of the Jewish community. In 2012, demographics led Congregation Achdus V'Sholem to create the Rifkin campus at its Fort Wayne location. It is the home for all local Jewish organizations, which include the congregation itself, the Jewish Federation, the Fort Wayne Jewish Cemetery Association, Northeast Indiana Jewish Genealogy Society, and Purdue Fort Wayne Institute for Holocaust and Genocide Studies. We thank Achdus V'Sholem's Madge Rothschild Resource Center for its assistance in the creation of this short overview. It has done a wonderful job chronicling the story of Fort Wayne and Northeast Indiana's Jewish community and the vibrant people who contributed so much over the years. Please be sure to stop by during your next visit to Northeast Indiana. The end. Now I need to wait for the applause to die down. Okay, I think it's ready. Now we turn to Micah Soltz.
Well, thank you, Dan. That was a really great introduction to Fort Wayne. And for someone who's not from Fort Wayne originally, that was really helpful and really well done. So here we have just a brief outline of our events today. And again, I want to thank everybody for attending. It's wonderful to see so many Jews together and friends together in this time. So it's really special that you all came out just for me and Dan. We definitely feel the love. The first part of the brewery tour, or sorry, the first part of the event is going to be a brewery tour. We're going to be talking about how beer is made in the modern day. Obviously, at the end of it, the part 3, we'll be talking about kind of the historical roots of beer in early human civilization, but we thought we'd start with how beer is made today. And so we'll do a quick little tour around the brewery, stopping along the way to talk about the different equipment, but also the different processes that are a part of modern beer making. The second part is a sensory and sampling portion. For those of you that are in the Indiana area and that were able to get beer delivered, for those of you that were in Springfield and I believe Peoria, reach out to me and ask for some appropriate and similar beers to try to sample along the way. For those of you in farther reaches, we're very sorry that we weren't able to include you in this. Beer laws in America make it very complicated to ship alcohol internationally on such a short notice. But we hope that if nothing else, you still learn something from this portion, and we'll include a little bit of history of the beer styles along the way as well. And then the last part, part 3, will have the actual anthropology of beer. And that's where we'll talk about beer's role and contributions to human civilization across the world and through the ages. So it'll be not necessarily going through it temporally, but we will kind of start from the beginning and then branch out to the various ways that beer is made and used culturally throughout the world today. And then in part 4, we'll have time for questions. If you have any questions along the way, please type them into your chat box, and Jackie Schreier will be helping us navigate those at the very end. So we'll come back at the very end and answer any questions you have. So go ahead and type those into the chat box, and Jackie will help make sure that we cover those. Right, Jackie? Right. All right, so we're going to leave it on that, and we're going to take a trip over into the brewery. Gil, you'll need to unmute my mic. Good. All right. Hopefully everybody can hear me. I'm not talking to myself. All right, so this is Chapman's Brewing Company. This is where we make all the magic, and we're going to start our presentation. There we go.
Right.
Maybe it might have froze for a second there. So this is Chapman's Brewing Company. This is where we make all the magic. First stop on making beer. So all beer is made out of 4 basic components: water, yeast, grain, and hops. So we're going to start with some grain on this tour. So all beer today is made out of malted barley. That is the primary component. The important part of that is that it's malted. So malted means that they start the grain with the very beginning of germination. So what happens is they let that grain begin the very earliest steps of germination. And so enzymes within the seed then start to break down those complex carbohydrates into sugars. I think we're frozen, so just hold it on there. Just hopefully it'll catch up. Carbohydrates. So once you have those simple carbohydrates, those simple sugars, that's what the yeast is going to turn into alcohol. So you can see here, has it caught up?
Is the Wi-Fi out here? No, it is. No, just.
It's nice and roasted there. So malted barley means that the seeds have started to germinate just inside just a little bit. The enzymes inside the seed have begun to break down those complex carbohydrates into sugars. And that means we have more sugars for the yeast to be able to turn into alcohol. There are different types of malted barley, and those are based on the roast. You can see these are nice and dark. They're going to add nice and dark coffee and chocolate flavors. This here is a lighter roast, as you can see. And that's going to add more nuanced flavors and typically what we call base malt, which
is really just a malt that doesn't add a lot of flavor, but adds alcohol or sugars to create the alcohol. And of course,
Is this the same product? It's the same plant product that's roasted differently, or are they different?
these are absolutely the same barley.
Okay.
The color and everything is really all dependent on the kilning.
And where's that done?
So that is done actually by specialists all across the world, and they're known. So that you can see here, it says Dingmans. This is a Belgian roaster. The different roasters have reputations for quality, and so every brewery has their own particular preferences, which roasters and which grain providers they go with, based on the recipes they've created over time. So once you have your malted barley, then you're going to take it over to our mill. And inside here, you can see our commercial mill. And Dan, once we can get in there and take a little closer look at it. Now we mill the grain because we want to increase the surface area when we start the wort process. And so we want to increase the surface area of water to grain so that we can pull more of those sugars out of the grain into the water, which then, of course, again, is food for the yeast. So while it's milling, it goes up this chute and ends up in our hopper, which is right above our kettle. This brings us to really the heart and soul of every brewery, what we call the brew house. So the brew house is consistent of the hopper at the top that carries the grain that you're going to use for your brewing, our mash lauter tun, that's where we're going to make the wort, our kettle, our fermenters, and our bright tank. And that's kind of the heart and soul of every brewery. That is what actually makes the beer. The first one is, so we have what's called a 20 barrel brew house. So you can see 20 BBL right here. So barrel is just a historic way in which breweries measure quantities of liquid. One barrel is roughly about 30 gallons. So 20 barrels, we're talking about 620 gallons or so per batch of beer that we can make at a given time. Hold on to that number because that's going to come back again when we talk about some historical references of beer. So up here on the brew house, when the brewer gets ready, he will pull on this lever, which will release the grain down into this chute, into the mash tun. As you can see, it has a little bit of a false bottom. There's some racks on the side that will help screen out the wort, the eventual wort. So the brewer has all of his grain inside the mash tun. He will introduce hot water. Basically what you're doing is making a tea of sorts. So the wort soaks up, that hot water soaks up all the sugars from the grain. He'll use a paddle without knocking Dan over. And this is where you'll see kind of these quintessential pictures of brewers looking hot and sweaty, matte. This is really where the term mashing comes in. They're mashing it up, they're moving around, they're spreading it. Again, they're trying to increase the surface area of grain to water to get as much of the sugars out of that grain as possible. The liquid that you have at the end, that's called wort. Wort is sugar water. So it's all those carbohydrates and sugars that they get from the grain in the water. There's a process called lautering. Lautering is the process in which we transfer all this wort over to the kettle. This is a process. The whole thing takes about 2.5 hours, depending. Each brewery can be a little bit different. There is some variation, but you're talking about 2.5 hours for us to process 20 barrels worth of wort into the kettle. Along the way, you are going to use that bed of grain that's inside the mash tun, and you are going to use that as a filter. So we drain out the beer. As you saw, there were some plates that will go on the bottom of the mash tun. That prevents all the grain from sitting on the floor. And then there is a hole at the bottom that pulls off the beer. We have a recycler at the bottom, and so it keeps going over and over again. This is where the 2.5 hours comes in. It drains down to the bottom. We refilter that beer, that wort, right over the top, and then it drains down through. And each time it does that, it gets clearer and clearer. It leaves more and more of the sediment in the actual grain itself. There's a little sight glass down there that we can show you a picture of later, and that helps the brewers know when it's starting to get clearer and clearer, and that's when they know they're getting towards the end. Through that process, they'll also use come on, you can take a look at these. These two little sprinklers right here, you can see one here and one here. That's for sparging. So that's the additional process where we wet down or hose down that spent grain and try to get every last little bit of sugar and carbohydrate off of that before we move on to the kettle. So the kettle is where we boil all that wort. So at the end of the day, what you got from the mash tun is sugar water. And that's what it tastes like. Slightly sweet water with a little bit of color, depending on, again, what how dark a grain you're using, whether it was really dark or whether it was something lighter. But we'll come into that, whether you're making a stout or making something lighter like a Pilsner. In the kettle serves two purposes. The first one, and it's very important, is sanitation. When you boil that wort, you're killing off any microorganisms that might have come over from the grain. So you're killing any bacteria, any yeast in the air that was riding on that grain, anything along the way, any fungus. And that way you make sure that we like to control our fermentation with the yeast that we buy, that we pick specifically for that style of beer. And so the kettle makes sure that we start with purely clean, sanitized wort. It also has another function that's very important, and that is the inclusion of hops. So we'll talk about hops a little bit more detail later, but this is what they tend to look like in the modern sense today. They look like little rabbit pellets, but they are chopped up. There's a little flour. It's actually part of what's called a bine, not a vine or a bush, but a bine with a B. And it's very aromatic. And inside these hops are little oil crystals that need to be isomerized. And so isomerized is the process in which you melt those oils down and include them into a homogeneous liquid with the wort. You can kind of think of it as similar to old school salad dressing that would separate. We don't want that to happen. The oils and the hops, we want those to get become one homogeneous liquid with the wort. And so the boiling helps boil down those crystals and then incorporate the hop oils into the beer so they don't separate later. Hops have various different characteristics today, most notably in their flavor contributions to the beer. Coming down off the brew house. So the time in which it's under boil varies by beer style and brewery, but roughly you're talking about an hour to an hour and a half, again, depending on the style of beer you're making and the particulars of the brewery itself. At that point, your beer is at 212 degrees. It's way too hot to inoculate with yeast and begin fermentation. We have an industrial heat exchanger, so it runs through this heat exchanger, drops the temperature down to a temperature that's much more amenable to yeast. And then we pump it off to one of our 5 fermenters. So we have a 100-barrel fermenter right here. We have 3 40-barrel fermenters, these smaller gentlemen right here. And then back in the corner, we have a 60-barrel fermenter. So 100, 60, and 3 40s. And then this gentleman right here, our piece of stainless steel, is what's known as a bright tank. This is where we finish beer. So this is the last little part where beer goes to get carbonated and get packaged. And you can see right here is a location where we actually connect CO2. And then on the other side, we have a carb stone, which is a ceramic stone with very tiny pores in it that allow to force carbonate that beer. Right now, I'd open this up for you, but right now we have 20 barrels of beer in here. As you can see, we're roughly at that 20 barrels line. So we won't be doing that. If you come through here, you'll see all of these fermenters except for one, are currently in the process of active fermentation. If you can see right here, this is venting off CO2 that's part of that fermentation process. So that sanitized water so that no bad bugs, yeast, bacteria can get into the fermenter and ruin our fermentation. This guy was bubbling earlier. Dan can attest to that when we were walking through, and that one settled down a little bit. And so you can see they are living processes. And then lastly, once you're in the fermenter, in the bright tank, then the last decision is whether or not to put it into kegs, which then go on to bars, restaurants, and our tap rooms, or we have our own industrial canning line in which we can use to can off our beer and sell at retail shops around Indiana. And so that is it. We have, again, a 12 head canning line, so that can can 12 cans at a time as it comes down through this rotary. Here we have, you can see where the lids drop down onto the cans as they come through here. The seamer attaches the seam and then spits them out into the canning line. And then we usually have a table and a couple people here helping to pack everything up into pallets and put them off in the cooler for shipping. So that's how modern beer is made. So we're going to go back to the tap room right now, and we're going to go taste some beer. Sound good?
Hearing no objections.
All right. How's everybody doing? Good? Excellent, excellent. So, there we go. So the first one, oh, I meant to tell everybody, now is the time to get your beer out. If you have beer, if you didn't already have beer out, now is the time to get your beer out. We're going to start with the Kolsch. After the Kolsch, we're going to drink or taste the Englishman, the brown ale. After the brown ale, we'll taste the Valiant. And then after that, we'll finish off with Undaunted, the single hop IPA. So this is a great time for you to go grab that beer if you don't already have it with you. That smells great. So when you're sampling beers, or at least here at Chapman's, we take this pretty seriously. So when we're sampling beers, we definitely have a way in which we like to do it, an order. Typically, you're going to start with your lightest beer. You're going to move through to darker styles and then end in hoppy styles. And the reason why we do that, obviously, is we want to make sure that your palate is primed to be able to catch all the nuances of each style and that nothing overpowers any beer that you had before it or after. So we're going to start off with our Kolsch, which is a nice light beer. Kolsch is well known as the traditional beer of Cologne, Germany. Kolsch was first truly developed or given its name by the Sunner Brewery in 1918. So this is not a terribly historic style. We tend to think of German beer as having hundreds and hundreds of years of history. That's not to say that Kolsch as a style doesn't go farther back, but given that name, it doesn't go back any farther than just about 100 years. So it's a relatively young beer style. That being said, if you go to Cologne, Germany, and say that their history of beer making is rather young, you might not make any friends. So don't take that too far. In America, we are apt to call them Kolsch style ales, and that is giving notice to the fact that only true Kolsches originate in Cologne, Germany. But it has become a really popular style amongst craft breweries today because it balances a number of really great attributes that we like. First of all, the Kolsch is what we would consider a hybrid style. So there are two different types of beer in the world. Though there are many different types of style, there's really only two different types. Those are ales and lagers. Ales are brewed with one type of yeast, ale yeast, lagers with lager yeast. And the main difference between the two is that ale yeast sit higher in the fermenter. So when they're fermenting in the fermentation tank, they sit at towards the very top. And they like to ferment at warmer temperatures, and they produce more esters. And esters are smell components. They are the things that our noses pick up that add to and contribute to smells. And oftentimes they're associated with fruity flavors. And if you smell the Kolsch, It has a nice, rich, almost kind of fruity note to its nose that you won't get from a lager. Lagers are much cleaner, don't have nearly as much rich aromatic character. So that's one of the really great aspects of an ale, which is it brings forth a lot of diversity in flavors. Lager yeast, which represent probably about 90% of the world's beer. These are the beers that are best demonstrated through our American domestics, Budweiser, Coors, Miller. These are all lagers. Those are yeast that sit in the middle of the fermentation tank. So they sit about halfway through. They like to ferment at a cooler temperature, and they don't give off nearly as many rich esters. And so that's why Budweiser, Coors, Miller are known for a more restrained flavor palette than what you get from what we would call ales. Most of the beers that craft breweries make today are under that designation of ales. And we will, of course, hit the most popular one today, which is the India Pale Ales or IPAs. So a Kolsch is a hybrid style. It's brewed with ale yeast, but it's treated like a lager at the end. So when lagers, what makes them truly a lager, other than the fact that they utilize lager yeast, is that lagers are cold fermented for about 3 to 4 weeks after they're done fermented. So after primary fermentation, where about, again, 85 to 90% of the alcohol is, or sugars are consumed and converted into alcohol, there's a resting period on at low temperature. That's lagering. Most ales are not lagered. Kolsch is. And what that does is that contributes a really nice, crisp, clean finish to the beer, whereas most ales will have a very rich and long aftertaste. So go ahead, if you haven't already, and taste your Kolsch. And again, what you should notice at the beginning is up in the front and the mid palate, you're going to get more fruit notes. We really always get a lot of apricot notes out of our Kolsch. But again, notice that it doesn't leave a really marked impact in terms of aftertaste or finish. And that's due to that lagering that occurs at the end. And so Kolsch is this great hybrid style that brings and highlights really the greatest parts or elements of both ales and yeast, and produces a really crisp, really clean, really refreshing beer that has a lot of unique flavor to it. Whereas domestic beers have, at least within the craft community, been designated as lacking some of that nice flavor. Moving on to our second beer, Englishman. Let me go pour an Englishman. So for those of you that we're not able to get a delivery of Englishman, while I was looking for substitutes of this style for people in Illinois to be able to try find something that was similar. Kolsch, a lot of craft breweries make Kolsches of their own. You'll see subtle differences between them, but the Englishman is truly unique in America. It is not a beer that you're going to find very commonly. This is a Southern English brown ale. Most of the brown ales made here in America are American brown. They tend to highlight more of the nuttiness. Southern English brown are basically the London pub style beer. These beers are very popular in London. They're low alcohol. That's what we call sessionable. And you can sit down for a whole session and drink a number of them and hopefully be able to stand up and walk out on your own 2 feet. But characterized by a lot of flavor. So notice when you smell and taste, dark coffee is almost always the one we get. Is a lot of coffee. We get figs, we get caramel and toffee notes out of the Englishman. Lots of rich flavor. A little bit sweeter. It's not what we would call like a sweet beer, but it doesn't have a really markedly dry finish it's kind of a round and soft finish. So it's a little bit softer, a little bit more sugar in the beer to help kind of maintain a nice, easy drinking style. This beer style of the Southern English Brown goes all the way back to England. Again, it's a pub style beer. The first one was developed by Man's Brown Ale. Excuse me one second. Dan, you got to turn that off. There we go. That way we can get rid of that echo. Sorry about that. So the Man's Brown Ale was the first one. It was of this style. It was developed by the Albion Brewery in London, East End London, by Thomas Wellsthorpe in 1902. Before that, there were brown ales of various styles. In fact, the brown ale goes all the way back to some of the earliest beers in Europe. But this particular style of brown ale was developed in 1902 by Thomas Wellsthorpe, and really didn't pick off and didn't get really a lot of momentum until the great gravity drop of 1914. And for those history buffs, what happened or what ended or concluded around 1914? World War I. And it was at this time that the English government decided they really did not want to be spending precious grain after the war on high alcohol beers. And so they were promoting low alcohol beers throughout England as a way to prioritize that grain towards food. They also wanted to ensure that people were not taking too much advantage of the alcohol and having too much fun. And so they wanted to promote a lower alcohol beer. And it was during the early 1900s, after the World War II, that the brown ales, the English style brown ale, really started to take off in England. In America today, it's still not a terribly popular style. You don't see other breweries making a brown ale year round. And that's where we set ourselves apart. We love this style. We think it's rich. We think it has a ton of flavor. I highly recommend an Englishman with a hamburger. It is absolutely to die for. It's a great complement to red meat. Really delicious, holds up to it. And of course, because of that low alcohol content, doesn't fill you up nearly as much as the modern day IPAs that tend to come in at almost twice that alcohol content. So moving on to our next beer, this is going to be our Valiant American Stout. All right. So you can see the stout is significantly darker than the English brown ale. Much more rich when it comes to baking chocolate, coffee notes. You can smell the coffee. One thing you might notice, might not, the coffee is very present, very strong. It also has a little bit more hop characteristic, and you'll definitely notice that when you take a sip. So please enjoy. There's a little bit of bitterness that you get. And that, again, some of that is imparted from the actual dark malt itself. And so it leaves kind of those coffee notes, and we all know coffee has a little bitterness to it. But additionally, the story goes, at least here at Chapman's, that when we were early developing this beer, there was a batch that was over hopped. And so too many hops were put into that batch. And when you're a young brewery and you make 20 barrels, about 620 gallons of beer, and you make a oops, it's a very expensive oops. And so they tasted it and they said, hey, this tastes pretty good. It's not that bad. Let's sell it, because we're a young brewery and we need to sell as much beer as we can. And wouldn't you know, people love that style. Now, over the years, that was about 8 years ago. Over the years, we've walked back the hops from that first initial over hopping and developed a recipe that we think is a good balance. But what I like to think about this, because it's something that really is unique, and we've won gold medal on this beer twice now, is that it's very unique with that extra hops. because it helps clear your palate. You know, hops are bitter, and it helps refresh your palate and let you start over. Most people think stouts are very heavy, and that's from the flavor, not necessarily from the alcohol. Guinness, probably the world's most popular stout, is typically around 4% alcohol, so less even than Englishman. But you know, when people think about it, they think about it as drinking a meal. It's heavy, it weighs you down. You know, that's not something you can drink on a hot day. It's not terribly refreshing. And that's because of all those heavy, rich, dark flavors like coffee, baking chocolate, accentuated by the fact that Guinness adds nitrogen to their beer to make it feel creamier. And so that extra creaminess plus the nitrogen really kind of make you feel like you had a meal. To counter that with the Valiant, Valiant's roughly about twice the alcohol of a Guinness. Sorry, I believe actually Guinness is closer to 3.5% if I'm not mistaken. So we're roughly about twice as much alcohol, but it feels much lighter. And that's because, again, as you take a sip, you get those nice, beautiful, rich, dark flavors, but then the hop oils help to clear your palate, help to make you ready for that next sip. And so a lot of times when we're selling this and we're talking to people that are fans of this beer, we'll often talk about this as a summer stout or an all-season stout, something that can be drank all year long because it doesn't weigh you down and have that heavy, dark feeling and weighty feeling. So talking a little bit about the history of stouts. Stouts, the word stout itself in English vernacular goes back to 1677. There's a mention of "we will drink your health both in stout and best wine." But back in the 17th century, a stout beer meant something that was hearty, that was big and strong. It did not necessarily distinguish color. That didn't come for another nearly 150 years or so later. In 1817, Daniel Wheeler in England invents the roasting kiln. And obviously you can kind of think about what we were talking about and showing you those dark malts in the brewery. That's where we got to the point where you could reliably create dark roasted malt and hence reliably dark roasted beer. From that, Guinness quickly picked up on that style of beer and started creating several different porters. One of those porters was called the XX for extra stout porter. And from there, the word stout grew out to mean a beer that was dark, just like the Guinness XX stout. So it's an interesting little history for the term porter. And then the last one in our sampling is, oh, here, my glass, our Undaunted IPA. Poured the wrong one. There we go. Sorry, the brewery's closed, so all the tags are off the taps today. I have to guess. First thing you'll notice, IPAs, lots of rich pine and floral notes in the nose. That comes from what we call dry hopping. Gives it a rich nose. So before I talk about the illustrious history of IPA, which is something that has a very colorful past, our IPA is what's called a single hop IPA. So for those of you, I like to kind of use an analogy that's similar to wine. A lot of wines are blends of different grapes, even if it doesn't say so on the label. So your Cabernet at home might actually have some Merlot or some Zinfandel, Petit Verdot blended in. And as long as it's over a certain percentage, then legally you can call it Cabernet. IPAs are very similar. Most of the breweries and most brewers use various different hops to be able to draw out the various different flavor components that they want to get in their beer. So they might use one hop to draw out more of the kind of citrusy notes, another hop to pull out more pine notes. And some hops these days that are becoming very, very popular have more tropical fruit flavors and are less bitter. And so the various recipe that's used we'll be able to create a rounded beer. When we developed our beer, again, as a very young brewery, we had a very utilitarian approach, and our owner came to our brewer and said, I want to be able to make this beer all year long. Hops are expensive, especially all these really popular, crazy hops that are coming out today, these designer hops. In some ways, it's similar. If you guys are familiar with all the different, it seems like every time I go to the grocery store, there's a different kind of apple I've never heard of. The same thing's true with hops. New hop varieties are being created before the pandemic quite often. I haven't heard any since the pandemic, but I'm sure we'll hear about a whole bunch of them once everything comes out of this, but rapidly. So the owner of the company said, I can't, we want to be able to make this beer all year long. There's all these popular hops that are really hard to get your hands on. I want you to make it out of a hop that we know that we can make all year long, we can get our hands on. And so the brewer picked out a really classic American hop called the Chinook. Chinook is a very nice rounded hop. It has good pine elements. It has good floral elements. And what the brewer did to be able to adapt by only using one hop was he has 4 different additions throughout the brewing process. So if you remember when I was talking about the kettle, that's when you include the hops. When you include the hops, so how long it's boiling, will actually determine what flavor components you pull out of that hops. And so he uses 4 different additions at 4 different times, at 4 different quantities or weights of hops at that time, but all of the same hop. And then at the very end, when it's in the fermenter, he dry hops it. And so this is where you take hops into the fermenter and you actually kind of wash the beer with hops. You don't isomerize the oils that way, so you don't get nearly as much impact on flavor. But what you do is really give a beautiful aromatic quality to the beer. And so it's adding a really nice floral element to the beer, which you get on the nose. So IPAs have a very classic and prominent place within craft beer culture here in America, but worldwide as well. They represent roughly 70 to 75% of the craft beer market in the United States. So it is by far the most popular style of beer within the craft beer market in the United States, but also worldwide. And all of that originated in the 1700s with the East India, British East India Company. So hops, in addition to adding that really great kind of pine and floral and citrusy element, also act as a sanitizing agent. So the hop oils retard bacterial and yeast growth. And that turned out to be very advantageous on long rides from England to India. And so beer would frequently go bad on that very long voyage from England to India. And what they over time found out was that by providing more hops, it provided more stability to the beer, which then meant the beer arrived in India in better shape and people enjoyed it. There's lots of different little elements of the story that are kind of sensationalized, but those are the basic elements that hops do provide stability. And we find it even in our own beer that our IPA is the most stable in our cans, whether it's in the grocery store on dry, warm shelves or at a cooler. The hops retard any kind of yeast or bacterial growth within the can, which is a major benefit of hops. So moving on. In this last portion, we're now going to talk about beer and culture, and specifically getting into the anthropology of beer portion of this talk. Anthropologists have been excited and enthusiastic about psychoactive agents, particularly alcohol, but various different ones throughout the world, and their social, economic, and political contributions to human culture since the beginning of the field. There are various reasons and ways in which alcohol and other intoxicants bind people together. Obviously, alcohol has a reinforcing of hospitality. Thinking about in our own society today and traditionally, it's common to invite a guest into your house, again, when that was something that we could regularly do. If you can all remember back a year ago when that was a thing. Might invite someone into your house and offer them a drink. And it might be considered in some people's houses rude to not offer them a drink. And that might or might not be alcohol. Again, that depends on your house, but it is something still very common within our society to ask someone into your house and offer them something to drink and eat. It fosters communality. It's very common. Again, I grew up outside of Indiana, and alcohol was common at most parties, birthday parties, family parties, not into excess, but it wasn't uncommon for alcohol. And I think as Jews, we can very easily see the link to our own culture where alcohol plays a prominent part of many of our festivals, our meals, and of course with Passover coming up, the 4 cups of wine, traditional, right? Leading into that, we have the ceremonial and everyday activities of alcohol consumption. Again, as I mentioned, alcohol feeds into ceremonial uses throughout many different religions. I just mentioned Passover, but you can also look at sacraments within certain Christian sects. But that also, as we'll see as we discuss some cultures around the world, pervades to just about every culture. It is a dietary staple and a luxury item. When you ferment grain, you unlock the caloric potential of that grain. And so many cultures viewed it as an actual dietary staple. It helped feed cultures, as we'll see. And of course, a luxury item is a marker of wealth and status. People throughout time and different cultures have used alcohol as payments to both chiefs, leaders, and fellow members of their communities to help increase their social status. But we'll talk about each one of those. We'll hit on those as we jump around different cultures and different time periods. I just briefly want to touch on the fact that when we're talking about some of these early aspects of beer, it's a very different product than what we went through today. And that was part of the reason for walking through the modern production of beer, was to give you an idea of what we do today, the product that you see in a can. But what we're going to be talking about will be very different from what was made historically. First of all, hops were not used in beer until roughly the Middle Ages in Europe. Before that, adjuncts were used to stabilize the beer and flavor the beer, and those varied widely beyond, from culture to culture. Fruits were very common. Dates, pomegranates, herbs were common as well. And in this example, you can see a beer that was developed by an experimental archaeologist, Patrick McGovern. He worked with a very popular, very famous brewery called Dogfish Head, which has a whole program that's dedicated to revitalizing ancient beer recipes. And one of their most famous ones and early ones of this program was called the Midas Touch. And that's because if you're familiar with the ancient story of King Midas, to everything he touched turned to gold, his funerary complex has been discovered in Turkey. And so from that funerary complex, they were able to recover vats that had resin of ancient beer. And from chemical analysis of the resin, they were able to determine that the beer that King Midas drank had muscat grapes in it, honey, chamomile, thyme, and oregano. And so from that, Dogfish Head, along with Patrick McGovern, were able to reconnect or revitalize this ancient recipe and try to find out what beer was like, or what kind of beer King Midas would have drank. I've never had Midas's Touch. I've seen it before. It's a flavor profile that has never really called out to me, but I know many people that have. What I've heard is it has a lot of almost wine characteristics. And again, as you can see, though it has a base of grain in it, they did include muscat grapes, which is a very aromatic grape. And added a lot of wine characteristics. They used honey, again, very sweet. and then the herbs. And so it was a very different product than what you would see today. No hops at all in that beer. So moving on to human civilization and beer. Beer has been found, really evidence for beer has been found at every early civilization, and really at the earliest evidence of every center of civilization across the world. In 1953, a rather prominent anthropologist by the name of Robert Braidwood questioned the roots of domestication of cereal grains, which had for a long time been associated with the desire to create bread, and said that maybe this was actually due to the desire to make beer, not bread. People in the brewing industry love this, love to cite this. It is obviously unresolved. It's not clear, but what we do see is that with the earliest evidence of civilization in each part of the world, beer production is very quickly alongside with the domestication of grain. So whether you want to say that they were, civilization was built on beer or on bread, what really seems to be is that they go hand in hand together. That as human civilizations domesticated grain, very quickly after they began to ferment that grain and turn it into a beer-like drink. The earliest evidence for beer production in the world comes from Zhehu, China, roughly 9,000 years ago. This is before large-scale human civilization, but you do have domestication of grain at that time in China. So it's very early on in the process of domestication. Their beer is based off of rice and then has the adjuncts of hawthorn fruit, honey residue, and various other herbs and things to help provide stabilization to the beer. Interestingly enough, it also goes along with the earliest evidence of Chinese written character. So again, what you see here is that the complex elements of human culture, people living together in larger groups, coming together under bureaucracies and governments, written languages and characters are part of that process. All of that seems to go hand in hand with both the domestication of grain, but beer as well. And so beer is this thing that very quickly human civilizations begin to create and enjoy as part of a cultural element, along with the development of complex society. I don't know. I have neighbors. Living next to those neighbors might drive me to drink, that kind of thing. As you can see right here in this picture, Dogfish Head Brewery also has a beer that they have dedicated Jiahu, which is, they call it Chateau Jiahu. And this again is where they attempt to recreate the beer that was first, the earliest beer in human civilization that we've been able to recreate so far. From China, then we jump to the Middle East and the Zagros Mountains of Iran at the Godin Tepe site. This is where we really find the first evidence of complex human civilization alongside with beer production. At the Godin Tepe site was a center of trade along various trade routes in the Zagros Mountains. And here we have early code of laws, demonstration of organization on large scale irrigation systems, bureaucracy, and of course, a much more elaborate formal writing system. Evidence for beer, again, comes from the analysis of clay jars that suggests that both beer and wine was produced at this site. There's evidence of what's called calcium oxalate, which is called an art at the breweries, beer stone. Once every 3 to 4 years, we have to buy very specific chemicals to help remove beer stone accumulation from our mash tun and kettle. So it is a natural product that still today is a byproduct of the brewing process that is found in the resins of the earliest beer brewing sites in the Middle East. Most prominent amongst the early cultures in terms of beer production is Egypt. Many of you will probably have heard very recently, actually, I believe it was before we or after we even set out and organizing this talk. A very prominent article came out about the earliest industrial scale brewery identified in ancient Egypt. Beer and bread were foundational to Egyptian society. From Egyptian records and text, we know that every major Egyptian festival involved beer. In fact, Egypt had a quite prominent reputation for its beer across the ancient world. There's written records of historians from the Greek Mesopotamian area that were disparaging Mesopotamian beer in comparison to the quality of Egyptian beer. Mesopotamian beer was said to have a lot more chunky, floaty structures. They didn't do as much of the job to clear out some of the sediment, whereas Egyptians had a process that ended up in a much more liquidy, less porridgey-like beer. Egyptians are also credited with developing straws to be able to drink out of early beer jugs, so they wouldn't get all that big, chunky kind of leftovers from the mashing in. You can see here in the picture off to the side, hundreds of clay beer vessels discarded at an ancient Egyptian site. This is just to give you an idea of just how central and how prominent beer played in Egyptian society. Again, I mentioned the archaeological site of Abydos, which has become very popular recently. Dates back to about 5,000 years ago and is considered to be the largest industrial scale brewery. Abydos was a early funerary complex. So to step back a little bit, the very earliest of Egyptian kings united Egypt under one rule a little over 5,000 years ago. So this is right at that time when Egypt became what we think of as ancient Egypt, one unified kingdom. Before that, it was split up into smaller kingdoms that were ruled by little warlords. There was one king who is only known in the archaeological record as the Scorpion King, who was known for unifying all of what's called Upper and Lower Egypt, which ironically, if you're looking at a map, are flipped because as you go from the south to north, you're going from higher elevation to lower, hence the Nile River flows out into the Mesopotamian. So the Upper Egypt is the southern portion of Egypt, and the lower Egypt is the Nile Delta, excuse me. So King Narmer was an early successor to the Scorpion King, and one of the first Egyptian kings after unification, in which we have clear written records about their history and their achievements. And it's right around this time that we see the production of this industrial scale brewery in Abydos, Egypt. Abydos is similar to the funerary complexes that we would later on see in Giza with the three major pyramids, and then later on what's prominently known as the Valley of the Kings, where King Tut or Tutankhamun was found buried. The rites and rituals of burying these early Egyptian kings were centered around beer. There were huge parties. To give you an idea of how much beer was able to be brewed at this one site, they're estimating roughly about 22,000 liters, which is 5,811 gallons. Remember, that brewery back there, that 20-barrel kettle, can brew 620 gallons at a time. So one batch of beer out of this brewery roughly made about 9 to 10 times as much as we make in one brew. So it's a really amazing accomplishment at the very earliest part of ancient Egyptian civilization, really at the very beginning. And to give you an idea from ancient Egyptian texts, we know generally what those early pharaohs gave as rations to their workers, and that would have roughly fed enough beer for about 8,800 workers. This evolved into the pyramid complex at Giza, where for a long time, at least for the last 20 to 30 years, we have archaeological evidence of massive infrastructure for building the pyramids, suggesting upwards of 20 to 25,000 people working on that period, on the pyramids. Potsherds from beer jars are the second most common archaeological find in that complex. And what archaeologists, and we even have archaeologists from Israel, that help support this idea and suggest it's very unlikely that the Jews were slaves and building the pyramids. First of all, the time periods don't add up. At this point in the Giza pyramid complex was built roughly about 3,000, 3,500 years ago, and that's before our historical record of Jews existing. It's much more likely that Jews or slaves might have been used for building the city of Ramses, which was about 1,000 years later. What the Egyptians would do is, if you're familiar, the Nile River would flood annually, very regularly, and deposit very nice silt, which was what the Egyptian civilization used for growing grain. While their fields were flooded, people would then be used to come and build the pyramids, and they would be fed on the beer and the bread that was being brewed in these large, massive infrastructures. And so early on, at least during the period of the Giza pyramid complex, it seems that there's more evidence to suggest that beer helped funnel or create and fuel the pyramids complex than slave labor, though it is very likely and possible that slave labor was used at later dates. In sub-Saharan Africa, 13 to 25% of all grains grown are used for the processing of beer. Nigeria is probably drinks about 70% of all the Guinness production in the world. Guinness is extremely popular in that part of Africa. When you get down to more traditional styles of beer, they vary widely dependent upon the customs and resources. People use ginger and honey, which are available locally. The Koma of Cameroon have the cattle dance ceremony, which honors hard work and positive maternal qualities. So mothers that are considered to be good, hardworking mothers. And each individual that throws one of these ceremonies attempts to increase their social status by redistribution of meat and beer. And interestingly enough, after your seventh feast, the gentleman who throws the feast gets to drink from his own pot of beer without having to share with others. So that's your reward for being a good member of your society and sharing your beer with others. You get your own. And the last example that we have across the world is what's known archaeologically and anthropologically as chicha. Chicha represents various different styles, but the most common one is made from corn. It can be made with manioc, which is a South American term for cassava, wild fruits, cacti, and potatoes. The most notable aspect of chicha is that it is orally processed. And this means that groups of people, communities will come together and chew on corn and spit it into a communal bucket. And that chewing processes the corn, helps break it down. You can think about malting. You can think about the mill for our grain. It does the same process. In addition, the enzymes from your mouth also help contribute to the beginning process of fermentation. Just so you know, they do boil it after that. And then after that, they leave it in vessels to then ferment. Pottery going back as late as 5,000 years ago in the Andean mountains also suggest very similar to the vessels that are still today used to store and carry chicha. Very strong cultural significance. There are songs, there are rituals, there are festivals, and social divisions around who's allowed to drink chicha, where and when. The Huachiri manuscript, which actually is not Incan, It is Wachiri, which is a population that was subjugated by the Incan, but was recorded by Spanish conquistadors. Suggests that it was bad manners not to share your travelers with chicha, or sorry, your chicha with travelers and the poor. Similar today in terms of our own ideas about charity and sharing alcohol with guests of our own. In the Andean society, it's common for chicha to be used in important offerings to Inti, which is the sun god, and Pachamama, the Mother Earth, as well as offerings to their dead ancestors as part of a cult of ancestor worship. And that is all. Thank you for sticking with me, folks. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Micah. That was so very fascinating. And thank you, Dan, for wonderful hosting. We have time for a couple of questions that came through the chat box. Rob Goldberg from Buffalo would like to know, what do you do with the grain after the wort is created?
Good question. So, and this is quite common amongst many breweries, most of the ones that we know. Local farmers we collaborate with them, and they come and pick up the grain and feed it to their livestock. So we have 2 grain trailers in our parking lot. If you come up in the summer and it smells really bad, it's because we're waiting for those farmers to come and pick it up. They're not always as prompt as we'd like them to be.
Okay, that's great. Gil from Israel he said he can't drink
Jackie,
4 cans. Gil said he can't drink 4 cans of
Jackie,
beer.
we can't hear you. Sorry.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
I can't hear you, Jackie. I can look through the questions though.
Okay.
Do you patent your recipe? Who develops your RICO? Sorry, what's the RICO? I'm not familiar with that. Recipe. Sorry, there we go. So no, we don't patent them. This is something that when I first joined the brewery, I asked and discussed with the brewer as well. Every brew system is very different. And it's very hard to copy or emulate somebody else's beer on your own system. There are
It's not working.
little kits that are sold for you to be able to brew, home brew, large breweries' famous beers. And again, the reason why they sell those, other than that it increases their own branding and reputation and makes money for them, is because they're never really worried that you're going to be able to steal their beer. Some breweries are more adamant about it than others. I know that Budweiser keeps theirs under lock and key as if it's their holy grail. We've never really been concerned about it. When we talk to our brewer, it's really go ahead and try to make our beer. It'll never really taste the same. And there's a huge spirit of collaboration and communality amongst the craft breweries. But some breweries definitely do, but we don't. Let me see here. Jackie, if we can hear you again, what is the most experimental or historic style that Chapman's has undertaken? We don't have the luxury of being Dogfish Head, which is a very large, very prominent brewery, and that just actually merged with another large brewery, Sam Adams. We've never done anything like that with a historical style. We're still really trying to develop classic beers that appeal to everyone. So if you'll notice the 4 beers that we sampled as part of our core, we really feel like those are beers that everyone can enjoy. They cover the foundation of what is the classic palate styles that people like. So we're definitely not the most experimental brewery. There is a brewery here in Fort Wayne where a gentleman makes beers that taste like margaritas. I know I was at his brewery, and he had a Blue Hawaii beer, and it tastes like if you know the cocktail Blue Hawaii. He's very good at it. It's amazing. He can make a beer taste like a margarita. But you know, we kind of joke, if I want a margarita, I'll probably just make a margarita and get tequila. You know? But we're not necessarily the most experimental brewery.
Micah, can you hear me now?
How long can these beers sit out after being open? They're really best within a probably a 12 to 24 hour period. They'll lose their carbonation pretty quickly. That's all I can say. Drink in good health. Does your beer need to be refrigerated? It does not have to be. Our beer has been filtered, especially the beer that goes into the cans. The beer that comes out of our draft system, which we deliver in these growler pitchers, is draft beer and has not been filtered. That beer needs to be refrigerated and kept refrigerated. But the beer in the cans can stay. Obviously, a cold, dark place is better than a warm, hot place.
Good.
Any other questions?
Micah, can you hear me now?
We have a friend who makes a matzah brew from leftover matzah. How about that? That's pretty impressive. The one thing about that's interesting, I'd be interested to find out and maybe on a home scale system, this wouldn't be a terribly big problem. One of the things that we mention is when you're sparging, the beer is the grain is filtering the wort. It's kind of coming through the grain. Some of you might be familiar with wheat beers. That's a popular style. Wheat beers can have a problem where the wheat actually there's not enough husks in the wheat, and it turns into like a cement. And the problem is that you can't get the beer to lauter. You can't get it to get through that mash. It gets so tight, so mashed up,
Michael,
compacted that you can't get it to come through. And I wonder with matzah if you might have the same problem. On small scales like a home brew, it's much easier because you can kind of manually work it to mix it up. On an industrial scale, you get something that kind of mashes together, comes together like that, and all you have is that big, or it becomes a potentially what we call a failed brew.
Micah, can you hear me?
Let's see here. We're sold in Fort Wayne. We are sold at all the package stores, and we have been moving into Walmart's, Kroger's, and Meijer's over the last recent period. And we are actually getting ready to release our beers in 6-packs and 12-packs beginning in early April. And then we'll be in more and more of the grocery stores. If you live in the Fort Wayne area or Northeast Indiana, again, we deliver regularly 5-6 days a week. You can have beer delivered directly to your house with a no-touch delivery system. So safe, you don't even have to leave the comfort of your home. Let's see, curious if you have a favorite style that you enjoy. In all alcohol, whether it's beer, wine, or liquor, it really just depends on the mood. I do like IPAs. I definitely fall into that category. But like I said, if I'm having a hamburger, there is really nothing better than an Englishman. It is just an absolutely delicious beer with steak or a hamburger. So it really just depends on the mood and what I'm eating or what's going on at the moment. And it looks like not kosher for Passover. This beer is not kosher for Passover. So enjoy it now. For sure. Well, if anybody else, if anyone had any last questions or comments, otherwise for those of you in Northeast Indiana, it is a rare treat because the sun is shining. So if you do have some outdoor plans, I'm happy to let you go to it, and hopefully with just a very light buzz.
Micah and Dan, thank you very much. Thank you, Partnership Together. Thank you, everyone. Appreciate
Well,
seeing
thank
all of
you. I
you.
appreciate it. And thank you for sticking with me. I know we went a little longer than we had said, but it's because it's so much fun to talk about beer.
Yeah, thank you. Great to see all of you. Looking forward to when we can be together. Bye.
Hi, everyone.
Sorry, Jackie, we still can't hear you. I see Jackie talking, but I still can't hear her. I don't know if she has a
Hi,
technical
everyone. Good
difficulties.